Good evening. This is Mae Brussell one more time. This is program number 585. It is February 21st, 1983, and we will now begin with the disclaimer. I put it on the air, but I didn't hear it come through the studio here. Maybe you got it on the air. In case it didn't come over, I'll say again that everything that I say in this program I'm responsible for. The station is not responsible for the material, the content of what I put on the program. It is my responsibility, and I take that. I've done the research, and it's my responsibility. It does not belong to the station. Just before I came to the station, well, actually this afternoon when I was reading the papers, I read that Mr. Bluhdorn died, Bluhdorn. He's the head of Gulf and Western, a very important name. I could do an hour right now on Mr. Bluhdorn's connections to the various matters that we've been discussing in the past few years, just continuously as an ongoing investigation. I'll put that off until next week because there's so much to do. The Gulf and Western part of it was bought by Michael Sindona. Many of you know his name, or Michele Sindona. He was on TV this week on the program Frontline, Jessica Savage's program, and I'm going to discuss a little bit of that with you. He was involved with Michael Sindona with the Dominican Republic with Richard Nixon. His company had a share widely known for Paramount Pictures and Madison Square Garden. The Madison Square Garden connections go to Gene Harris, who worked there for 2 years, and Dr. Tarnower up in Westchester, and also then into the organized crime syndicate up in Westchester, Frank Sinatra and the mob and the drug connections up there. And out to Hollywood, to Frank Sinatra, to Caesar's Palace, to the notorious Wells Fargo scandal that we did a lot about several years ago with Harold Smith, who said there was 200 or 300 million missing, and he was charged with 23 million gone out of his account, the Beverly Hills account of Wells Fargo. There is a large network of conspiratorial links going to Mr. Bluhdorn's career, to his money, to the Vatican buying into this network. And it's interesting that he died. He was flying on a plane from New York on a business trip. He was at the Dominican Republic, and he was flying home, 56 years old. They said his death was a heart attack. It's a very interesting time for him at this age to pass away because, again, he's one of these pivotal people like Roberto Calvi or Grace Kelly, who falls right into the middle of a lot of interweaving conspiracies that are being exposed because of the banking connections. Cortland Gross of Lockheed is another one of those. And I've, from time to time, almost every week, put the missing millionaires or the dead millionaires or the corporate people who are being offed, who had links to exposés that are taking place now. He was 61 among Fortune's 500. He was linked as 61, but he's now dead. And next week we'll do more on Mr. Bluhdorn and the connections to a lot of the stories in the news at the present time. Last week I mentioned to you that in regards to the Battle of the Bulge, that was the most important battle of World War II. I stand corrected by a friend of mine whose sense of history and knowledge is equal or maybe greater than mine. And she instantly reminded me that the Battle of Stalingrad, the Soviet Union holding against the Germans, trying to take over Russia, was the pivotal battle. That indeed was the most important battle of World War II. That is actually true. The reason I mentioned the Bulge is important was because when the Germans lost at Stalingrad, the highest German officials agreed with the United States Army officials after 1943 that they would retrench and organize themselves, and they met the United States Army at the Rhine and stalled the war 7 months till all the cash was taken out of Europe and put in South America and Asia to begin World War III, to rearm and start over again. And all of Hitler's top generals and his intelligence chiefs, everybody he trusted, the geniuses behind the operation of Adolf Hitler from his early years to his rise to power, Martin Bormann and Reinhard Gehlen and the whole gang, the generals, were all moved to the West Coast along the Rhine and became partners during the war. While our soldiers were dying and freezing, they were partners with our government and the OSS and the forces that were supposed to be fighting the Germans at the highest echelon our generals were working with their generals, our intelligence was working with their intelligence, and the people that were decimated on the battlefields and were left frozen and shot were the field soldiers while all the shenanigans were going on. So the strategy of who was in that geographic area was a climax to the World War II, because they run the world today and have positions of power and making major decisions today. But they wouldn't have been there if the Germans had won that war at Stalingrad. As a matter of fact, Mr. Klaus Barbie is saying in Paris, and he said on the way home on the plane, that you're just making a fuss about me because we lost the war. If we'd won the war, I would have been a hero. Because we lost the war, you're saying I'm cruel. Also, last week on broadcast number 584, I gave 8 categories of subjects that are in the news separately and also linked together in some of the stories interwoven that are taking place regarding the scandal in the Vatican now. But I left off probably the most important one out of the ad. You'll add to your sheet, and I'll print it up for you, those who get the tape, or you can write to me and send a self-addressed stamped envelope. And I've drawn a map for you, also a chart of the Odessa, called the Spider, the Odessa. If you send a self-addressed stamped envelope to me at P.O. Box 22511, Carmel 93922, or my home address if you have it, I'll send you the chart of the Spider, the Odessa, and the Pentagon, and also the 9 branches that are important. The Banco Ambrosiano with Roberto Calvi, the Vatican Bank with Paul Marcinkus inside the Vatican. He physically can't leave there. Licio Gelli with the Masonic Lodge and the network of the nest of Nazis in the Odessa. The drug bust, the gun running, the murders, the bank robberies, the Cold War out of Georgetown Center for Strategic Studies, and the Vatican art scandals. But Licio Gelli certainly should be among those names. And if you send me an envelope, as I say, I'll send you a new chart. And those who get the tapes will automatically have it in the mail, those that subscribe weekly. Now, Klaus Barbie, this Nazi that is in Paris, is saying he's very open about what he did. He said, yes, I killed the leader of the resistance. That was my job. And he said his only crime was to be on the losing side. Now, for his defense, he's asked for a dossier on war crimes since World War I, but particularly since World War II. And he wants to show that the Americans were just as brutal in Indochina in interrogating. Well, we had tiger cages. We threw them out of airplanes. We had the Phoenix program where William Colby was responsible for killing 30 or 40,000 Vietnamese and became director of the CIA. Now, Klaus Barbie is saying, I want to know what the French did in Vietnam, in Algeria, what the Americans did in Indochina. His defense is, tell me all the atrocities that have happened and see if I'm any different. But the answer to that is that by incorporating the Nazis into the American army, even while the war was going on, we became the Nazis. America had done a lot of things to the American Indian, to the American blacks, but never went for the wholesale murdering and shipping weapons to all these various countries until that marriage of Reinhard Gehlen to Allen Dulles, and what it produced was a generation of monsters who only think of killing and atrocities. Now, I'll be doing a lot more on Klaus Barbie later. There's several articles that I do want to mention for you that refer to statements that he's saying or the investigation of his case. The Washington Post, February 13th, has a story, Did the United States Protect the Nazi Butcher? The New York Times, February the 8th, French are still trying to crack Barbie's American connection. Barbie sought information on Romania, and that again goes to the Iron Guard. They're trying to crack who he had connections with. Well, they should listen to World Watchers, and they'd know. The LA Times editorial, The Truth Must Be Told. May, the truth can't be told. San Francisco Examiner, February 16th. Barbie's now accused of killing Soviets, that he was involved with killing. This comes out of Moscow, that he was responsible for killing Soviets as well as French resistance. Los Angeles Times, February 18th. Reagan is urged to probe the alleged U.S. Barbie links. If he went into that, he'd go to the Hoover Institute and to Richard Allen and the William Casey and people that were working during the war and after the war and protected him. And Mr. Fritz Kramer, our darling Fritz Kramer from the Pentagon, and that's the bottom line, Mr. Kissinger and Fritz Kramer and the American generals and the staff. And during the war, we brought over Germans from IG Farben and from Germany, such as Fritz Kramer or Peter Drucker, and we brought them into this country, Henry Kissinger, and let them then go back and meet with their fellow Germans. And the consequences are what you're reading every day in the paper. The Associated Press and Monterey Herald, February 16th, the French knew Barbie's hideout all along, according to Serge Klarsfeld. Worked for the CIA and West German intelligence for at least 8 years. They didn't say continuously. There was no CIA until 1947 officially, but 45 to 47 it was the OSS, and then it became the CIA. And this man has been working with them and many more also. Another article, the U.S. may probe its agents' activities with the Nazis. This was a story in the LA Times, February the 11th. To probe the relationship of our federal agents to the Nazis would to go back and let them play 11 years of broadcasts of World Watchers that Mae Brussell had on the air here on the Monterey Peninsula. That is what I have been talking about for so many years, is the United States government, from the time that they saw they couldn't win the war against the Soviet Union, with partners with Germany to set up what you're on the eve of, and that is World War III. There's a new book out by Anthony Cave Brown, and a friend was at the station just a few minutes before I went on the air. He knows my interest in Fritz Kramer and the connections of the Germans to our American military, and he brought me a photocopy of some pages of the new book of William Donovan of the OSS. There's a new biography out by William Cave Brown, and there's just a couple of paragraphs here that just make my blood boil just to read them. One is January 24th, 1945. Now, the war was over May 8th, 1945. As the German panzer armors were withdrawing from Ardennes, that's the Battle of Bulgaria, Mr. Donovan, he was the head of the OSS with Alan Dulles, staying over in Switzerland. Mr. Donovan advised the Joint Chief of Staff that the German ambassador to the Vatican, Baron von Weizsäcker, Weizsäcker, and Kessel, Kessel, that's one of Hitler's top people, had informed a British representative that they were prepared to give important information concerning General der Heinz, Heinz Guderian, and von Rundstedt was prepared to open the Western Front to Eisenhower's army. See, they held that line until the Vatican representative is with William Donovan deciding when they'll open the line for the American troops to go into Germany. And what they had when the Americans went into Germany was all of Hitler's top chief of staff. And it's chapter 45 in this particular book. It's a new book that just came out, how William Donovan worked with the Holy See, the German ambassador from the Vatican, and Mr. Canaris, Hitler's head of his Western intelligence, and Pope Pius XII, and every move in the Vatican, and holding off till they got to the bridge at the Rhine, the Remagen Bridge, that very questionable, the controversy of the Remagen Bridge I'll do later with you. The Vatican was in charge of the military operations. And John J. McCloy, I want to do part 2 of the story of John McCloy and the importance of McCloy. He also was there at the scene when the Americans entered Germany. The top people that made every decision for us after the war were right in that physical territory, getting ready again for the bloodbath that is going to come. And it seems that it will be inevitable because the planning is so open of these people, and the opposition hasn't even begun to touch how insidious and terrible it is to have a relationship, the head of a particular church making deals with the top Nazis. And that's why you can see why Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence of Eastern Division, was knighted by the Vatican, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Before he came to the United States, he came here and set up our CIA pattern after Hitler's Gestapo. That's what it was made after, with all its loopholes. But the Vatican was right there planning the strategy and giving the word, the representative of the Holy See, of the Pope, when they would open the Rhine so the American troops could come in. And what were they coming in for? not for world peace, to meet the top German generals and make a bond. You know, when children are born today, there's a lot of talk of bonding between parent and newborn baby. This was the bonding at the Rhine of the Nazis and the American corporations and the military minds who hated the Soviet Union so much that anything and anybody who didn't like the Soviets became an American and was incorporated and funded by the Americans. Before I go to John J. McCloy, I want to mention one part of the program that was on this week on television called God's Banker. Frontline was the program. You can order the scripts if you didn't see it. Write to Frontline, Box 322, 2134. This is in Boston, Massachusetts. The zip code is 02134. And tell them you want the program on God's Banker and send $4. It was showed the week of February the 14th to the 19th. Now, Jessica Savage took a complicated story to try to do in 1 hour. As the New York Times reviewing the TV movie said, it's a complicated financial story, rumors of right-wing politics, underworld figures, secret Masonic lodge trying to take over the government, the God's Banker in charge of the Vatican, working with right-wing dictatorships, and funding solidarity of $40 million in Polish uprising in Poland. That is difficult to try to even touch, but the poignancy of this, if you think that such a dog as Calvi can be poignant, is the way he was cornered in a hotel. And I'll do more about the hotel next week, where he stayed, but he was put into a little area boxed off, and interestingly enough, and shaves off his mustache, and I'm sure with his passport under another name, and he had 18,000 American dollars. He was supposed to go to Brazil, but 4 miles away he was hung by a bridge. But there was one name in there that I don't want to go too far afield on that particular program, because there's one name that you might have missed. It went so fast, and I've mentioned it before, and it's come up in other news stories. That's Francesco Pazienza, Francesco Pazienza, Francesco Pazienza. Now, his name came up in this program only because he's an Italian who set up in a meeting with Roberto Calvi, who is the president of the Banco Ambrosiano, Italy's largest bank. It is going bankrupt, and there's $1.2 billion that is not accounted for, that the Vatican signed notes for, and there's a lot of financial shenanigans linked to 200 major banks in Europe. So he has to have a way out. Calvi has to have a way out, and Francesco Pazienza introduces Calvi to a man named Flavio Carboni, Carboni. Then Flavio Carboni sets up a meeting for Calvi to meet a man named Silvano Vittor, Vittor. His first name is Silvano. And in this particular TV movie, that is all that is mentioned about Pazienza, except that there is an interview with him. Besides his setting up the two men who are going to take Mr. Calvi to his death place, and there's no doubt about that when you see the movie, there's an interview with him, and he's photographed on the screen, and he said that he wanted to buy 12% of Banco Ambrosiano, that $1.2 billion, just the Panama area, and Roberto Calvi wouldn't have had to die. He wouldn't have had any trouble. That would have been it. But Calvi turned him down. Now, Calvi's wife and son said the Opus Dei, the Vatican organization, killed her husband and his father, the Opus Dei, and that they wanted to put up money to buy off the shares and then control the voice and the policies of the Vatican. Well, if Francesco Pazienza was the man putting up the 12%, and the family says it had to do with the Opus Dei, we must assume that there aren't that many people that came forward with $1.2 billion the day that he died. He wanted to put up money and buy off what were dummy fronts in Panama, their door openings not identified. Nobody's told where the 1,002 million or 1 billion 2 million is. There's no explanation of that. But what were they going to do with that money, and who was going to put up the money? That was asked on television of Mr. Pazienza, who was going to put up the $1.2 billion, and there was a long pause as if he wasn't prepared for the answer, and he said a consortium. He wouldn't name the people. He says there's 2 banks, and he wouldn't name the banks. He said a group of Iranians, and then he said 2 Americans, and he didn't say 2, and 3 Saudi Arabians, and he didn't say who those Saudi Arabians would be. Now, this Mr. Pazienza, I mentioned his name on broadcast number 581. That was January 24th. If you want to look that up again, because these go pretty fast, it had to do with the disinformation of the story that the Bulgarians and the KGB tried to shoot the Pope, that this was actually disinformation, and it came from an article in these Times it had to do with an article about Michael Ledeen, Alexander Haig, Paul Marcinkus, and links to the secret lodge of Licio Gelli and the Nazi connections in South America. The Ledeen connections, that's October the 8th, 1982, and I had it on broadcast also November the 8th, 1982, tape 570. There's 2 tapes where I refer to the Ledeen connections, but it's the one broadcast 570 where I said Francesco Pazienza was with Roberto Calvi and Professor Ledeen, and they worked close, and they were, according to this one article, an American thread that goes into the case inside Ronald Reagan's staff. Now, this is very important for material I'll be giving you next week. But Francesco Pazienza was working with the P2, with the Vatican, and he was described as part of the disinformation group of Mr. Ledeen from the Georgetown Center of Strategic Studies and the State Department. He's assistant in the State Department and worked at the UN. And he was the connection with Alexander Haig to Ronald Reagan's staff, and his name comes up in regards to that just a few months ago. His name comes out again, Mr. Pazienza, in an article, Financier Murdered. It's about the death of Roberto Calvi. This is out of the Vatican. It's the Catholic Reporter by Peter Hebblethwaite out of Oxford, England. And this article refers to Francesco Pazienza as being the alleged CIA agent in control of Paul Marcinkus. Now, they didn't tell you that on the program. Keep in mind that Pazienza on this program is making the introductions to Carboni and to Vitor, who are going to arrange that Mr. Calvi be murdered. So if this man works with the CIA and with Paul Marcinkus, then they are murdering Calvi so he won't expose the Marcinkus connections. And Calvi told his family, I may have to expose and explain what is going on. And in that case, it would go right to the Vatican, the scandals of the money that has been going on for many, many years, at least 10 years, and they were pinning it on his problems. Now, this same article makes the connection of Mr. Pazienza being in New York City, meeting in New York City in an apartment where a famous mafioso was, and Michael Sindona and Licio Gelli and a priest who was later arrested for smuggling art in the United States. They were waiting for Roberto Calvi's son, and the meeting was set up again with Mr. Pazienza. Mr. Pazienza, the supposed CIA agent, summoned Carlo Calvi, Roberto Calvi's son, and was in the company of in the apartment of a mafioso chief of Mr. Sindona and a priest arrested for taking art from the Vatican. So Pazienza is involved with the top mafioso in the United States, with the Central Intelligence Agency, with the art smuggling out of the Vatican that was pouring into the United States. And some of these were treasures taken from the Vatican after World War II that ended up from the Villa Borghese estate and John Paul Getty's home. And I can do more later. I'll do on the art scandal because those are stories in themselves. I want to stick with Pazienza. Now, in the program, he mentions that some Iranians are going to buy out the Calvi involvement in Banco Ambrosio and the Vatican to save their face. Now, there was a story just a couple of weeks ago in the New York Daily News, January 25th, 1983. The Pope elevates 2 people to a special team. He formed a new foundation just this last month, several weeks ago, a month ago at this time, in New York. The purpose is to promote the Polish Pontiff's ideas and purposes for a spiritual unity of Europe, to promote the Polish Pontiff's idea and purposes. And he put several people that are named to head this foundation. It's a new foundation. It's called the Vatican Foundation of Saints Benedict, Cyril, and Methodius, the patron saints of Europe. But he put some Americans on the board, and one of them is Robert Armao. Now, Robert Armao served the Shah of Iran. He was the chief of staff of the Shah of Iran. He's active with the Pahlavi family now. He's active with the Pahlavi Foundation and with the Vatican money, and he's been elevated by the Pope to a special foundation. So we have on the one hand Mr. Pazienza saying that Iranian money was coming in to clear up and assume these debts so the Vatican wouldn't be embarrassed. And then an Iranian representative, Mr. Robert Armao, is given a top job by the Pope. He starts a new foundation. He also, Armao, worked with John J. McCloy and forced Jimmy Carter to bring the Shah to this country. And he was the chief aide to Nelson Rockefeller when he was governor and vice president. And the second person that the Pope put on this foundation was Robert F. Wagner, former vice president, he's vice president of his new group. He's former mayor of New York. He was once the United States envoy to the Vatican. Now, his father, Robert Wagner, if you remember going back, we have so many names on this program, his father was a law partner with Simon Rifkin, and Simon Rifkin is one of the attorneys who set up the law offices for the corporation TCI, Transcomputer International, that brought Otto von Bolschwing to international activity after World War II. Otto von Bolschwing was Adolf Eichmann's superior, one of the top Nazis and head of the Gehlen operation, allegedly in the United States, whose law offices were set up by the father of the man who now, he set up the network. Von Bolschwing worked through John Paul Getty also and the Borgheses and traveled all around the world with his Odessa Nazi network. But one of the men, the law office of Rifkin and Wagner, his son is now part of this Vatican Foundation, and it's interesting that the two people named, one is Iranian and the other is Wagner, because as these different news stories and appointments go, they always go back to that same Odessa network. That's why I finally drew a pattern of the Odessa network to show how the spider works and the intricacies of what was the dream of Martin Bormann and Adolf Hitler for the 1,000-year Reich, and to show you how it's so active now. It hasn't faded away. So in summary, just to mention Francesco Pazienza, the man who set up the killing and the people that were going to eliminate or have Roberto Calvi done in so that he wouldn't break their connections to the Vatican and Paul Marcinkus and the CIA, and even going to the Reagan administration. This goes into the mafiosi in the United States, Ronald Reagan's offices. Francesco Pazienza set up the meeting of Calvi with Flavio Carboni. Carboni then met with Silvano Vittor, a drug smuggler, and then the movie shows how they take him from Trieste, the smugglers in Trieste, and then up to Vienna, and then fly him to London and set him on his course, and I'll do more on that next week. But this complicated pattern, it isn't really complicated. I keep saying it is, but after a while, if you send for that sheet that I have and you get to know these names, and I've drawn them out, Licio Gelli of the P2 Masonic scandal, he set up Hitler's brown shirts. He worked with Franco. He was the equivalent of the Gestapo for Mussolini, and after the war, he wasn't tried as a criminal. He fled down to South America, Argentina, where he had dual citizenship, was brought back in the 50s to Italy, and was caught in 1981 planning the overthrow of the Italian government with all the top officials of the government to put in a total police state. They were ready to flip it over like a pancake and say, it's ours, and they were exposed. They were looking for papers on Michael Sindona because Calvi had brought him to Italy after he'd been arrested in the United States before his trial, and they came into Calvi's place and got the list, and that changed the Italian government. So once you know the name Roberto Calvi, Licio Gelli, I don't want to confuse you, it's Licio Gelli, who was doing these operations. And Roberto Calvi was the banker from Ambrosiano, who was going to give Gelli some money for further operations. The day that Licio Gelli was arrested in Switzerland, he was getting $60 million out of the bank that Calvi had put there for him from the Banco Ambrosiano. It was the night that he was arrested, the next day that Grace Kelly had her accident, and the day after that she died, and that same day Bashir Gemayel was killed. These are not separate incidences. If you know Michael Sindona, Roberto Calvi, and Licio Gelli, and Paul Marcinkus, if you get those names straight, eventually, because you're going to see them in the news like the Watergate over and over again for a long time, if you get them straight in your head, the interweaving stories will get less complicated, because it is complicated, but the names appear everywhere. So when the name Francesco Panziano was used on the program Frontline, just a couple of instances, there is more to him, and it goes right to the Vatican and to Ronald Reagan. We'll take a 1-minute break now and continue in a moment with this program. We'll begin the second side of broadcast number. I number these broadcasts because you may want to order the tapes. They're available if you want them. Broadcast number 585, and it's side 2, February 21st, 1983. We record it right off the air, and as I say, they're available by subscription or separate. If you miss a particular broadcast, you can get it. Sometimes events take place and you don't think they're too important at the time, or that news item doesn't interest you as much as some other stories, but then some other news breaks later, and you go back and say, oh, I wish I had that. I remember the name, and those tapes are available. Now, I want to do on this side of the broadcast and for this half hour, the second part of the article in Harper's Magazine called Minister Without Portfolio. John J. McCloy. It's written by Alan Brinkley. It's Harper's, February 1983. There are some copies in Pacific Grove, but the bookwork's still available, and I've copied it if you're out of town or your town doesn't have it, and you write to me, and for the cost of copying it, I'll send it to you, figure out what that costs, and you can get copies of this article. I mentioned last week the several roles, important roles that John J. McCloy had, but I didn't go into the details of what he did in those positions. Assistant Secretary of the War during World War II, he oversaw the American occupation of Europe, Asia, and Africa. He drafted the post-war reconstruction of Japan and Germany. He supervised during the war the internment of the Japanese. He helped forestall military action against the Nazi death camps. He wouldn't stop them running. He became president of the World Bank. He guided international investments. He was chairman of Chase Manhattan. He was chairman of Ford Foundation and chairman of the Council of Foreign Relations that makes foreign policy decisions, on the board of Amherst and other colleges, director of 12 major corporations, including United Fruit. That's another subject I once did a half hour or so on. From 1950s, he articulated the Cold War foreign policy. He was a member of the Warren Commission, the attorney for OPEC that made the monopoly of the oil companies, the Seven Sisters. He was responsible with Jimmy Carter. He forced him to bring the Shah to the United States, and he handed out money for the Marshall Plan and decided where that money should be allocated. He was dangerously High Commissioner of Germany in 1949. He activated the Nazis and let them out of prison to start over again where they left off. He designed the structure of the Pentagon. He was the man who created Fritz Kramer's protege, Henry Kissinger, so therefore he and Kramer must be under John J. McCloy. They both take credit for Henry Kissinger. And I want to do some more details about his role as his treacherous life proceeded. Now, the interesting thing, he was a corporate lawyer, went into the law offices, Wall Street law offices, when he got out of Harvard Law, but he was handpicked by Henry Stimson. Stimson was his early sponsor. Now, there's a linear direct connection to Herbert Hoover, and Stimson was important to this story. Earlier, McCloy he was born in Philadelphia, as were so many of these people, went to Harvard Law, went to war during World War I. In April of 1917, he enlisted in the Army. And while in France, he was closely acquainted with two people he'd worked with very closely with after. One was George Patton, who wasn't a general at that time, and the other was George Marshall, who he would be doling out the money to overthrow the socialists or the would-be communists or stop them from getting into any offices or power in Europe or in other countries while we were reconstructing after the war. When he was through, they wanted to give him a commission in the Army, but he returned to Harvard in 1919. In 1921, he graduated from Harvard Law and went into the law office of Cravath, de Gersdorf, Swain, and Wood. You probably won't remember that one. But they sent him to France. This is very important. They sent him to France, the law office that he was in. He was 35 years old, and in 1930 he went to Paris. Now, these were the formative years of John J. McCloy that set the stage for all the things that he did later that I listed for you. He was there for 10 years, and according to this article, his main job of interest to the author is investigating German sabotage during World War I. Now, in 1916, there was an explosion in New York City. This is at the harbor there, and the explosives were supposed to go to the Allies, and it was the largest explosion in New York City. And thousands of bombs, tons of bombs went off the munitions depot. It was called Black Tom Island, so it became known as the Black Tom case. Well, for 14 years later, McCloy is trying allegedly to determine the cause of the depot being destroyed because one of the clients of the law office, he worked, a client of Mr. Cravath was Bethlehem Steel, and they lost a lot of money. So the Black Tom case took him to Europe, where he was meeting, according to this story, with Adolf Hitler sitting in his box at the Olympic Games with Rudolf Hess. And he met all the heads of Europe, and he could have been in a position. He was in France from 1930 to 1940. Now, those are the years when Hitler's coming to power. The Spanish Revolution had started and ended. Franco was in power. France was to deal with Hitler through the entire war. France dealt with Hitler, and it dealt, the Gestapo controlled France, but it dealt with America to American banks, so that France and Germany became one. Hitler took control of Germany, but American banks were working back and forth. And if he was there from 1930 to 1940, and he knew Germans, and he was in Vienna, he was in Berlin and Ireland, and all over the world, he could have brought in a family like the Kissinger family and Alfred Drucker, these people from Vienna and Frankfurt and the I.G. Farben connections. He could have seen that those people were traced over to here, and that the sons would strategically be in a position to be useful later. It just can't be any coincidence that the minute the war's over at the Battle of the Bulge, Henry Kissinger is pulled out of Army intelligence of the main line and given $10,000 and is placed right in his hometown, right near his hometown in Germany. And he's very kindly towards the Nazis. He never complained about them. It's very possible that because of the power that John McCloy had from those days until now, that he is the person that could have set up the network for those people to come to this country. Now, there's an article that I mentioned briefly, I believe last week, that Henry Stimson, he worked for Herbert Hoover, and he was a U.S. ambassador to Germany under Herbert Hoover. Frederick Sackett, Sackett, was the ambassador to Germany, and no one in the embassy knew anything about Hitler until the war. 1933 came. By 1939, they knew. But Secretary of State Henry L. Stimson, Stimcon, had no record in his diaries of anything about Adolf Hitler. He didn't see no evil, hear no evil. The American embassy under Herbert Hoover, and you have to keep in mind that after World War I, Hoover was instantly taking $50 million of American congressional money to the czars to get ready for World War II that didn't go into the mouths of these starving people. And John J. McCloy was over in Europe working on that Black Tom German espionage case. That was the excuse that brought him there. And he was brought to the attention of Henry Stimson, Herbert Hoover's Secretary of State, because Stimson wanted to drop the Black Tom case. He says, let's not pursue it. They didn't want to antagonize the Germans, and so the Germans bombed New York Harbor. That was 14 years ago. Forget it. That was Stimson's position. McCloy was there working on the case. Stimson was Secretary of War also to William Howard Taft. He was Secretary of State to Herbert Hoover. And he was working along with John McCloy in this time period regarding that bombing in New York City. Now, I can't believe that some bombing that happened in 1916 was so important that these figures from America of important decisions were worrying about that case. The Germans paid U.S. Steel $2 million, but in the meantime, Mr. Stimson, the representative Herbert Hoover, and John J. McCloy were very thick. In 1940, Franklin Roosevelt was getting ready to make appointments as Secretary of the War. One of his first acts was to appoint John J. McCloy as special consultant to the War Department of German sabotage. Now, he'd been 10 years in Europe, so he should have been aware of the trickery of German sabotage. So if he had been in Europe working on that case and the conniving and the bombing and the espionage of the Germans, then why was he from 1940 to 1983 so pro-Nazi? It doesn't make sense, except that he represented Chase Manhattan, the international bankers, Herbert Hoover, and the investments over in Europe up to and through the war and even up till today. So Franklin Roosevelt appointed him in the War Department as head of German sabotage, special consultant, and within a few months, he was the Assistant Secretary of War in World War II. Now, the War Department was his shtick. He got a lot of power there. This is a lawyer who allegedly was doing law work in Europe on German espionage. He created an intelligence system that broke Japanese codes. That's when he designed and supervised the construction of the Pentagon. And after Pearl Harbor in 1941, when we entered the war, McCloy was Henry Stimson's liaison. That's Herbert Hoover's man, liaison to the Joint Chief of Staff. Now, Herbert Hoover was a former president. Roosevelt was president, but he was chosen as the liaison with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, that's almost the role that Fritz Kramer, his protege, it would have to be his protege, had when World War II was over, as an advisor to the United States to all those confrontations that we've been having that Klaus Barbie wants to use as his defense. Fritz Kramer was put in a position as the advisor or liaison with the Joint Chief of Staff. And according to this story, he helped plan most of the major campaigns on both fronts. Now, this fits in with the Vatican, with William Donovan of the OSS, with Allen Dulles, who worked again with Chase Manhattan and the Rockefellers. He planned the campaign. You see, the Vatican was deciding when you can come to the Rhine and go to the bridge. The Wall Street lawyers were deciding where the campaigns would be. So in connivance with William Donovan, Allen Dulles, John J. McCloy, and the Vatican representative, and the top Nazi generals that I mentioned just briefly from this one book, they were all in collusion, and I'm saving and collecting the names of them. They all decided where they would meet. That's why I say that battle place was so important, because he was planning the campaigns. See, Montgomery, the British commander, would have gone through the Bulge. There wouldn't have been a battle. It would have been in Germany. But he was stalled and not given gasoline because General Patton was to be the American hero. He was to be there. Why was Patton to be there? Because he was to run the army school with the Nazis at Oberammergau after the war with General Fritz Kramer. And according to Peter Drucker, General Fritz Kramer was with Patton. If the new book by Anthony Cave Brown is correct, the German generals were sitting with the American generals side by side, and this General Fritz Kramer could have been Adolf Hitler's Fritz Kramer, because ours wasn't a general at all. But this is important because John J. McCloy planned the campaigns and fronts, as did the Vatican representative, saying, go ahead. He traveled with the troops in North Africa, and he was with the advancing armies when they went into Germany. I can't believe that McCloy hasn't worked all of his life since 1930 or 39 with Fritz Kramer, the American Kramer, the German Kramer, with Peter Drucker and Henry Kissinger. Those names are important, just as Licio Gelli, Roberto Calvi, and Michael Sindona are to the Vatican story. Henry Kissinger, Fritz Kramer, and Peter Drucker, because they gave us the bloodbaths that are Klaus Barbie's defense if he has one. What was McCloy doing in France in 1930 to 1940? His travels in Vienna, Berlin, Ireland. Did he meet these families, as I say, of Kissinger, Drucker, and Kramer? Kissinger's family moved to this country, but did he bring them over here? He was into such shenanigans. He worked with people like General Canaris and Galen and Martin Bormann and Klaus Barbie. As I mentioned before, just the titles and newspaper articles, I haven't even gone over them with you, how Barbie's worked for the United States government from, well, before the war and after the war. He's been in the pay of the United States government. When France fell in 1940, it just took 2 days for it to fall, and the Chase Manhattan was doing business with France. How much did he have to set up that connection? Charles Hyam's new book, it's HIGHAM, Trading with the Enemy, tells about Chase Manhattan and the Nazis and the Gestapo and the Paris banks. But did John McCloy get that transition ready? It just didn't happen. That Hitler goes into France and everything collapses except the banking continues to the very bank where McCloy is going to come home and be chairman of that bank. It doesn't happen that way. He had to be there so that when France collapsed, transitions with America were business as usual, just as they arranged from 1943 that when Germany finally collapsed, McCloy would be there to give them their money, build them up, release them from their prisons. He was, as I say, with those troops, and that's very important because the years he was in France, Leon Blum was the president of France. He was a socialist, elected in 1932. You can't have anything like that. They had to get the socialists out, and I'm sure his role with espionage, as much as anyone else's, was to see that no socialists got near any government if they could have their hands on those situations. This article in Harper says McCloy started working with Vichy France with an alliance. He persuaded Roosevelt to accept Henry Stimson, that's again Stimson, who was in the cabinet under the other presidents, and Herbert Hoover particularly, the proposal that the United States form an alliance with Admiral Jean Darlan of Vichy France. Darlan, according to this story, was and not according to it, you know, or you might not know, was a notorious Nazi collaborator, and McCloy insisted that he's the only man they could use in North Africa, that the Nazi collaborators should be on the side of the Allies. He convinced Roosevelt to work with Darlan, the Nazis. Henry Morgenthau wanted a proposal to turn Germany into a pastoral society. John J. McCloy defeated that. He wanted industrial capacity. He blocked the execution of Nazi leaders. He didn't want them killed. Winston Churchill wanted summary executions. He wanted that put off to protect them, and one of his roles was to have what was known as a Nuremberg trial instead of killing the Nazi leaders. And when the Nuremberg trial took place, who did he leave off? The top Nazis. He sprung out Hallmarschak and Mr. From the Krupp, the Alfred Krupp, whose name was just in the New York Times this last week. The Thysens they now have 180 subsidiaries. The Thysens, Thyssen AG, a firm that worked with Adolf Hitler, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, and set up a network as part of the Nazi network today. New York Times, February 5th, 1983, have 180 subsidiaries. And Krupp, the arms merchants, the ones who making the weapons, and still do, has today 180 subsidiaries, and IG Farben has 750 subsidiaries, enough to control the world, and they're closing in on a lot of people. I mentioned last week the Japanese internment. John McCloy was in favor of that, of locking up the Japanese. That didn't bother him at all. It thought it was good for them to round them up. As he turned down the request of the Jews, and I mentioned this before for you last week, to bomb Auschwitz, he said, no, we can't do that. It might provoke the Germans to be vindictive. How could they be more vindictive? They were mass killing maybe 4, 10, 20,000 a day, up to 30,000 each week or 40. How could they be more provoked or more vindictive? And he didn't want to do that. And he said, one quotation was, the cost would have been out of proportion to the possible benefits. To bomb the railroads that go to Dachau or Treblinka or Auschwitz, the cost would have been out of proportion. a nickel would have been out of proportion to him with that ahead, okay? He comes home and the war is over. 1946, he's set up these people, the meetings of these people of when the army should go in. Now he's at the Wall Street office of Milbank, Tweed, Hope, Hadley, and McCloy. I said before it was used as a CIA front with false law degrees, the most famous of those being Hans Tough. Then he's named to the Atchison-Lilienthal Committee for the International Control of Atomic Energy, which was actually to escalate the atomic bombs. He was very much in favor of any bomb that would blow. Their quotations in this article would be big enough and fine enough for him. After the war, he refused, and during the war, to bring Jews to this country. He said it would upset the balance of people, and yet we bring in Indonesians, and with Project Paperclip, they're immediately over 800 Nazis, their wives and families and children, top Nazis that were brought here, and then 20 or 30,000 more were here in prisons, Nazis that were brought in here into Oklahoma, Arizona, and Texas. But he wouldn't let, he was in charge of the domestic decisions during the war as well as the international, and he said no, that wouldn't work. But he got some reparations for Holocaust victims if they went to Palestine. Well, Palestine was British and was to have a battle and get the British out and become Israel. That was okay for him. In 1947, John McCloy accepted a job as president of the World Bank, created by the Bretton Woods Monetary Conference in 1944. And the World Bank would work for a few years until the Marshall Plan would get going and the reconstruction of Europe would take place. The decisions of John J. McCloy and his friend George Marshall, he knew from World War I. An example of the Marshall Plan and how it worked was in a newspaper, The People's World, June the 6th, 1981, by Mark Allen. One particular area he was writing at that time because the Liscio Jelly scandal, the Masonic Lodge, had broken, and the role of the fascists and Nazis in the Italian government that were still there since the war. And so this article came out that week, and he refers to General George Marshall, who had a special fund from the State Department for $10 million. It was funded the Italian fascists, the Italian newspaper, because the Marshall Plan was to stop communists, do anything you can, and use any media. The Italian politics after World War II was rife with fascist plots, according to this article, attempted coups, plus the United States intervention, and it was all designed to prevent the democratic rise of communism. That's why the Vatican was so anxious to work with the Nazis and the U.S. officials. There was massive U.S. pressure in 1947, that's when the Marshall Plan's about to roll along, to strip the socialist leaders and get rid of the resistance leaders, to not have any resistance, no people who oppose fascism, and no anti-fascists. They were put out of government. Now, this is exactly the role that Klaus Barbie had in France, to get rid of the resistance people, to kill them. He said, that was my job, to get rid of the resistance people. So the important thing is that here is the Marshall Plan working in Italy, and Klaus Barbie was working in France, and he continued to give them lists of the resistance of the anti-fascists. Sometimes if you wonder, why aren't there more people speaking up? Why haven't more people caught on? I know that there were death squads from the day the war was over up till tomorrow. And I see articles in the paper every day or almost every day of suspicious deaths of people that had the potential to speak up or knew something who are dead. In 1947, they stopped the resistance leaders and the anti-fascists. The United States government in 1948, the first year of post-Mussolini elections, the U.S. ambassador was Claire Booth Luce, who is also active with Paul Marcinkus and John Connolly, and read the book The Vatican Connection and the role of Claire Luce in this whole political scene. She was our first ambassador to Italy. This is their first election, and they publicly threatened that the military would intervene if any of these, so-called leftists or people with any new ideas. The main point is, you don't have to be a communist in the sense of Marx or Lenin or Stalin. Any new idea other than cold fascism was not allowed in these countries. It's not allowed in South Korea. It's not allowed in the Philippines or in Japan or any of the countries that in South America we put in these military dictatorships And where there are new ideas, we instigate these coups to get rid of the people who are working along those lines, such as Salvador Allende had to be killed, and Mr. Pinochet put it in his place. So they had their elections in 1948. In March 1960, a right-wing plot was formed by the CIA. It was very active by then, supported by the CIA. Fascist organizations worked with the American CIA. And the NATO files in the New York Times, October 1962, 1963 rather, a month before John Kennedy was assassinated, tells about their contingency plans for Italy, that they were going to try a coup then. We had our coup in November 1963, and in October 63, there were contingency plans to round up people to be arrested if there's social unrest. They might have known that a month later, if John Kennedy was killed, there would be demonstrations or people catching on or angry. So the American Army and the CIA had funded Italy and their organizations. The chief of SIFAR, SIFAR, the military intelligence leader from 1956 to 62, was part of this cabal of the armed forces. That's one example of where the Marshall Plan came in with $10 million, 10 million American dollars just for Italy. And you spread that around to all these countries after the war. No wonder we have this tremendous debt, and there's no explaining how it built up and how long it will ever, well, it never will be paid. There's no use to talk about. In spring of 49, after he set up the Marshall Plan, he went back to Germany and became the American High Commissioner. And there he had control over every basic policy of Konrad Adenauer. So Germany became really American in decisions. And then Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, became head of the German intelligence when World War II was over, after he came to this country and formed our Pentagon and reconstructed our National Security Council. We never had it till he created it, and the German minds created it. Then he went back to Germany, and John J. McCloy was over there in Germany. He was in charge of the 1.5 billion plan in Germany, 10 million in Italy. That's small. And Germany got 1.5 billion in the Marshall Plan, and he was the High Commissioner over there. And as High Commissioner, they had to decide what to do with the Nazis, because we were going now into the 50s, and many of the Germans insisted that they wanted a denazification, but others didn't. They didn't want it at all, and they decided that they wouldn't purge the government of Nazis. John J. McCloy says we'll have little Nazis that can work in the new government, and he set up a government where former Nazis went directly into public life. He said thorough removal of Nazis from public life is impossible. Little Nazis can work in the new government. So he said, we'll end our American involvement, turn it over to the Nazis, what he called the little Nazis. And by 1951, almost every person in power, then in Italy and now in Germany, was in control of the fascists who gave you World War II. Now, as High Commissioner of Germany, by 1950, he reviewed the Nuremberg sentences, except for 7 that were executed. He commuted 21 from death and gave the unconditional release of Alfred Krupp, K-R-U-P-P, of the arms firm that I mentioned now has his hundreds of subsidiaries around the world. He released him. He had slave labor camps and factories, arms factories, where he used people until they died just working on the job, just as they did at Punamund. He let him out, and then they began to rebuild Germany and the German arms. The excuse was that the Korean War showed how the communists would go south, down to South Korea from North Korea. So we've got to get ready and arm against the communists. You see how aggressive they are. And the Krupp became a big supplier of the Korean War. And it was the Korean War in 1950 that was the excuse for Richard Nixon's law office to bring Nikolai Malaxi, M-A-L-A-X-I, of the Iron Guard and other Nazis pouring into this country in 1950-51. The arrangements were made in 1943, you see, but this was a trick. It was a time bomb that was deployed of spacing the time that they would come to this country and the moves that we would make next. Well, the time is up. We have one more minute, and I have a little bit more on John McCloy. I think you get the idea that he was a major factor in determining the strategies of the Cold War of the 50s of Europe, the face of Europe in 1930 to 40 in Paris. And certainly when he came home, he was president of Chase Manhattan and the World Bank and the Council of Foreign Relations, making policies. We're right on the button, and it is 9 o'clock, so I've got to stop. We're out of time. I'm sorry. I'll be back with you next week. This is Mae Brussell, and it's KAZUFM in Pacific Grove, California.